if you're not engaging in the right things, then sooner or later you're going to come unstuck and your organisation is going to come unstuck. If you're not inviting people into that process, you're not actually leading anyone. This is just you. People make decisions ignorant of what's really happening, what's really possible, what the customers really want, and so on and so on. And these disconnects arise.
What leaders do is they always see outside. They don't see some inside, that even though trust, they think, the trust is over there, not here within me, right? So they don't tend to work on themselves. They try to fix the system, right? So
all my opportunities for training started off more technical type of training, but very quickly I gravitated towards more leadership oriented type training, and the ones that made the most impact were always the ones that gave me more self-awareness. Anyone who thinks that they know what other people should be doing without actually understanding the context that they are working in, is not being serious. And that applies very much to practitioners, and practitioners should be ashamed of themselves for prescribing without understanding context.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Curiosulus Chronicles podcast. I'm doing a slight change. Rather than every 2 weeks, I'm thinking to do this podcast every month. So one episode every month. This may change as we adopt and learn new things. So I'm not saying this will be all the time, but I may change it back to 2 weeks, every 2 weeks. But I think for now, I'm thinking, because summer's coming up, everyone's getting busy, and I'm busy, very busy as well with my work at job. So I'm thinking to just keep it once a month. But even then, the value will still be there. We will learn about leadership, we'll learn about coaching, how as leaders we can get better. Taking today's episode, I'm inviting Mike Burrows. Mike is a thinker, writer, and guide for leaders navigating change in organizations that are anything but simple. He's the founder of Agendashift, a framework that replaces rigid top-down change with meaningful, value-driven transformation. His latest book, Wholehearted, Engaging with Complexity in Deliberately Adaptive Organization, offers a new vision of what organization can be when they are built, not just to survive, but to thrive, by slowing down, helping out, and waking up. Today, we are diving into the art of wholehearted leadership. Before we speak to Mike, I would like to thank Abhyuda Global Coach Circle for their support. And if you are looking to get into professional coaching, please do check out their upcoming programs. I'm also doing their new mentor certification program very soon. So let's crack on with today's episode. Hi, Mike. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
How are you?
I'm very well, enjoying a bit of spring sunshine. It's suddenly warm this week.
Yeah,
so that's great. Yes.
It is. That's why I'm wearing the t-shirt. It's been really hot this week. So
yes.
Cool. No, thanks for joining Curiosulus Chronicles. So let's start from there then, Mike. What made you write a new book?
That's a good question. There's a few ways of looking at it. In some ways, it seems like it's my fifth book, I've got to say, and it sort of feels like the culmination of the others. There's revisiting, territory I've covered before, but in the light of a slightly different lens, really. If I'm not mixing my metaphors a bit too much there. It's also perhaps going in my time machine and fixing up some aspects of my past career. I had a career in management and leadership before.
Yeah.
I was involved in writing and training and consulting and those kinds of things. And I remember back when in the days after my first book, Kanban from the Inside, and I was focusing on Kanban training. I was always telling people to or encouraging people to think more organizationally. Not just think in terms of the tools, not just think in terms of the process, but think more organizationally. The trouble was I didn't really have a very good way of actually articulating what I really meant by that. It was something that was a bit more instinctive as much as anything. But if you look over the course of my writing over the past 12 years now, you can see, some development in that area. It was increasingly obvious in right to left. Right to left is you could say a process-based idea. Start from the right, start with needs met, happy endings to stories for our users, the learning accounted for, and so on. And we're always looking forward to those moments. And when we review our work, we're reviewing, what we can get over the line first. The essence of a pull system, a pull system that learns. and it's focused on the customer. That's what that book was about. But then, half the book is really about all the supporting infrastructure of the organization that actually makes that possible. So I talked about, the inverted pyramid, for example. Talked about, learning organizations and so on and so on, and different styles of leadership that supports all of that. And then in the back end of the second edition of the Agendashift book. So Agendashift, for those that don't know, I'm delving into what I now understand to be dialogic and generative organization development. So it's going away from process frameworks and helping organizations have the conversations they need to have. And, that's something, again, that was like a burning problem from my training days. I used to hate the fact that you do private training in an organization and half the people didn't know why they were there. And that really bothered me. I think a lot of trainers have just learned to accept it, but it really, really bothered me. And it got me thinking about what are the conversations that aren't happening? And how can we have better conversations? Conversations that might or might not lead to a trainer coming and doing some Kanban training. Let's make sure that whatever actually the organization decides to do is actually what the organization actually needs. So that took me down this path of very much down the organization development path, the dialogic and generative organization path in particular. It's one where it's not about the consultant selling a particular set of practices. It's or diagnosing a problem and then designing the rollout project to fix the problem. It's much more about engaging people, and you end up with change on a much broader front. But the change is coherent because there's a shared understanding of what what you're trying to achieve together, what the strategy is, and so on. Where should we be focusing efforts so that they should come together and achieve some broader end. So that was Agendashift. At the back of the Agendashift book, I sketched out the deliberately adaptive organization, which was just a retelling of a classic model from the 1970s, the viable system model. By Stafford Beer, but sort of explained in very lean, agile type terms. I slightly cringe when I look at it now because it kind of presents the model as like a bit of a flow diagram with different kinds of information flowing between the work and how it's coordinated and how the strategizing works and things like that. But I was, actually set off on an interesting path, and now I understand that model much more relationally. It's much more about identifying different aspects of the organization and how they relate to each other. And is that relationship healthy and productive? And it turns out that many, many organizational dysfunctions can be explained in terms of those relationships between different aspects of the organization being unhealthy, unproductive, unbalanced, contradictory, whatever. And it's a really good model because it describes every organization. It's a descriptive model, not a prescriptive model. And because it's relating different aspects of the organization rather than particular people, particular roles, particular groups, it's much easier to depersonalize the dysfunction and actually look at, well, what's the relationship between what different things isn't working? And instead of having one problem to solve or one set of people to blame, you've got at least three places to look. Your chances to do something better, have doubled or tripled. So that's kind of the 10-year story, 12-year story of getting to Wholehearted. So it brings together a lot of the older stuff, but reevaluates it in the light of the viable system model, which I've done. Should actually say also, I've done some new things with that, pitchforks at the ready from those that would prefer I kept it in the 1970s. But it's a much more complexity-aware version of the viable system model. It's a much more participatory, generative approach to it. It's not about the consultants telling you what's wrong with the organization and telling you how to fix it.
Yeah.
It's about engaging the organization in its own process so it can meet its challenges well. That's a very different approach to thinking about solving a singular problem with a monolithic solution, which I've been against from the beginning. And that's why Agendashift existed. I've been, it's been my hobby horse for the last 10 years. No more monolithic rollouts, no more 1990s style change management, and let's start getting people engaged and let's get that change happening on a broad front.
Yeah, and maybe like I've done the Agendashift Foundation, so for the viewers who don't know, and then I know you shared that Wholehearted there as well, and then I wanted you to share this, the meaning of your meaning of Wholehearted.
Wholehearted, right? Okay. Well, it comes
Yeah.
down to a quote. I don't have
Mm,
the quote in front of me, and it's a long paragraph.
mm,
But I read a brilliant book, beautiful book, The Timeless Way of Building by Christopher Alexander. I read that book while I was writing Right to Left, and I quoted a particular paragraph in Right to Left. Um, and I blogged about it while I was doing the writing. And I remember we had I was doing a workshop in London at the time, and we had a wholehearted curry to explore what wholehearted might mean. There were 16 of us, I think, in the
yeah,
basement
yeah,
of a curry
yeah.
house in London. And yeah, it's one of these words. It's a powerful word. It's a generative word. And actually, what I was really determined we would not do is use it as the name of a process or something
Mm,
prescriptive,
mm,
and try and take seriously what it actually meant.
mm,
And the quote goes something like, "It's just Christopher Alexander's an architect. He was the founder of the patterns movement, or the father of the patterns movement, and he talked about buildings being torn apart by their contradictions. There's something unhealthy about them, unwhole about them, and when we want them to be wholehearted, as he put it. Now, I'm not giving the full quote there,
mm,
but that is the origin of the term. And pointing to picking different words out of that, there's what would make in his case, the building, or in our case, the organisation, unwhole. There's the desire to make it more whole, and there's desire to be wholehearted. And there's like an energy to that
mm,
word,
mm.
wholehearted. And I turn that into engage, invite, celebrate. Engage
Yes.
with the right challenges, invite people to join with you, and you're not really leading if you're not engaging in the right challenges. You're not really leading if you're not inviting people into that process, and celebrate their successes, or be ready to celebrate
Mm,
their successes.
mm.
So beautifully simple leadership model. I mean, you all know when you're not doing it. um,
Yeah.
but it begs the question: well, what are the right challenges? And
Yeah.
so there's other stuff. This descriptive model of the organisation. Its amazing power at finding dysfunctions,
Mm,
um, and also explaining why things that aren't, things that are includes the relationship with our business environment and with our customers.
mm.
Things that aren't entirely under our control, and you could say that aren't actually our fault, but we
Yeah.
need to meet those challenges well. We need to serve our customers well. We need to understand their needs. We need to understand where they're going to be, so that we can be there for them. It's all those kinds of things. And it includes all of that as well. So you can take an inside-out approach or an outside-in approach, or whatever, and the model is still relevant. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and say if anyone looking into Agendashift, I'll put the link as well in the description, and
Okay.
definitely I recommend Mike your foundation course at least, for people to
Yeah.
come and
Yeah.
join and
Well, you put
understand
a link
more about.
directly to that.
Yeah,
It's a good, yeah. Foundation's a very good place to
yeah,
start. So yeah, put a link to that. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I will put and let's go on this wholehearted leadership, right? So you mentioned like deliberately adaptive organization in the book as
yes,
well.
yes,
So how does
yes.
this challenge the traditional notions of leadership?
So well, there's a few things going on there. I mean, there's the wholehearted thing first: engage, invite,
Mm,
celebrate.
mm,
And that's it's not. It's that seems to be like a very minimalist definition of what leadership is about. You've got to say, if you're not engaging in the right things, then sooner or later you're going to come unstuck, and your organisation is going to come unstuck. If you're not inviting people into that process, you're not actually leading anyone.
mm,
This is just you. And if you're not celebrating their successes, then well, something's wrong again. Any idea that your business is has any kind of agility, business agility, or capital A agile, or whatever, it's kind of absurd.
yeah.
If people aren't regularly, frequently trying things, making things happen. And as I keep saying, all of this happening on a broad front. And for it to happen on a broad front, you've got to have it, encouraged like everywhere. So, I think if this is something that organizations committed to, as well as individual leaders, I think that actually, you know, that does actually represent a change to the way the organization wants to be, and the way it wants to be led. And then there's a deliberately adaptive organization, which is basically a reconstruction of the viable system model. So I rebuilt it in very much the same way that Stafford Beer originally built it, but I start from somewhere a bit more 21st century. So background to Stafford Beer, before he was, famous as a cyberneticist, he was his background was operations research.
Okay.
He cared about how things like steel factories worked.
Right. Right.
And back in the day, we're talking, the 60s and the 70s. That was very much focused on how does the operational side of it work? Literally, how do we get bars
How do
of
we get
steel
it?
to leave the
Yeah.
factory, efficiently, and then how do we manage our operations in such a way that's going to keep things, not just flowing well, in a very narrowly lean sense, but more broadly, still in a lean sense, in a way that is actually giving the market what it needs, giving customers what it needs. How do we build a more adaptable organization? And that's not a terrible place to start. But if you think about the perhaps it's unfair to call it the modern organization, but the digital age organization, and organizations that need to or choose to operate in a more digital kind of way. And in those kind of organizations, and it's very obvious if you've ever been involved in digital product development or service delivery of any kind, really, is that delivery, discovery, and renewal go together. So delivery is obvious what that is, delivering the work. But at the same time, you've got to be discovering what is it should we be delivering. And what's been interesting about the last 20, 25 years is that we learned that sometimes the best way to discover things is to deliver things, but it's to have very, very tight, very fast feedback loops. And you have a hypothesis about what the customer needs, and the customer will even tell you what they need. But it's only when you actually deliver do you find out whether that actually meets their need, whether it helps them make meaningful progress, all that stuff. And at the same time, you've got to be building your capabilities. You're bringing people on into the team. You're developing personal skills. You're developing team skills. You're developing tools, technology, platform, product, all those kinds of things. Not only to deliver tomorrow, but also to build a platform for next month, next year, and so on. And I think it's easy to accept if you've been exposed to digital delivery that those three things need to be very, very closely integrated. It's not someone else pulling the levers of discovery while you're doing the delivery. They absolutely have to go hand in hand. They're just inseparable. So that's where I started. And it kind of ends up with two pieces of good news. The model still works, and arguably I can even slightly simplify it. There's one relationship that's in the classic model that in my model you could argue is no longer necessary. So you could say mine is the more parsimonious model, if you want to use a piece of jargon. You've got a simpler model that explains the same thing. That's often considered a good thing. Now you could argue whether my model is simpler or more complicated. But integrating delivery, discovery, and renewal, is that simpler than talking about operations and strategy being separated? Now that you can, I don't care. In the end, I think the model stands up very well with that relationship there or not. And the issue that relationship represents is that you need to be anticipating what the market needs. You need to be anticipating what your customers' needs are going to be. You need to be that. You need to aim to be there for them. And I can think you need to shape demand. All these kinds of things. And I think you can argue that with that relationship there or without. And I kind of have it both ways. I talk about the relationship without drawing it, so everyone's happy. So that's the deliberately adaptive organization. It's a complexity-aware reconstruction of the viable system model scoped to the digital age organization. That's the not very catchy catchline for it. And the complexity-aware bit's important as well. Every time we draw diagrams, we risk glossing over the detail or the differences of different people's experiences. Now, you can get away with it when the model is an abstract model of all organizations and you can fit most people's experiences into it. As soon as you draw concrete models of an org chart, of a process diagram, anything like that, you always miss out, interesting detail that actually may be very relevant to people's experience. And if you're trying to improve their experience and trying to improve the capability of the organization, I think that's a bit of a problem. It depends on what you're trying to do, and sort of top-down analytical approaches can work. If you're looking at the high-level governance structures of an organization or the high-level relationship between the organization and its market, well, why not? But if you want to do something very engaging for a wide number of people, diverse people, get to the hidden constraints in the organization and so on, then I think a more generative approach is appropriate rather than an analytical approach.
Yeah.
Not many people are doing that. I think
Yeah.
it's quite innovative to take such a classic model and to use it in such a different way, a generative way rather than an analytical way. That it seems to fall to me to champion it, so that's what I'm doing in the book. So there's some real innovation there, not just bringing it up to date, but some real innovation, I think.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that. That brought me into thinking, like, in the book, I think I haven't read fully, but I was just reading the summary as well, and you mentioned some models, right, for leadership models.
Yes.
It was a clear, I think, heroic.
Chapter 3. It's models of trust building leadership.
That's it. Trust building. Yeah, that's it.
Is a section on chapter 3. So, so before we get to that, why have a chapter?
Exactly.
It's called mutual trust building.
Trust building. That's what I was thinking.
Why have a section in that book called models of trust building leadership?
Yeah.
And there are a few fundamental constraints on the organization that Stafford Beer, I think, was, it's the genius of the model, probably the genius of the guy, I think is a fair description as well. He published a model in his first book, or the first full textbook on the model was Brain of the Firm, 1972.
Brain of the Firm, okay.
Yeah, so he talked about basically the operational side of things and the more strategic side of things. And he showed us how to show that in terms of the information demands of the organization, that things added up. That you need a certain complexity of the organization to deal with the complexity of the outside world that you're engaging with, fairly obviously. You need a certain complexity in terms of how you manage that, to manage the organization itself in order to manage that relationship with the outside environment. And he argued that these things needed to add up. They need to be equivalent to each other. And then he, to his embarrassment, realized that couldn't possibly be the case. There is no way that the executive of the organization had the communication bandwidth, and you could argue whether they have the cognitive bandwidth, but certainly not the communication bandwidth to do all the things that was actually demanded of them by the model. And slightly embarrassing. And then he realized that and this goes back to my earlier point about complexity in a way. If you model just the formal aspects of the organization to whatever level of detail you like, but you nail all that down, you can never make it add up. You can never make the strategy bits and the operational bits actually have a healthy enough relationship. And that's a problem. It means that people in the operations side will make decisions ignorant of the strategy that they're supposed to be, delivering against. And likewise, on the strategy side, people make decisions ignorant of what's really happening, what's really possible, what the customers really want, and so on and so on. And these disconnects arise. What he, I imagine, to his huge relief, realized actually that the formal structure, the formal process isn't everything. And an awful important part of leadership is actually attending to that imbalance. And it's through all the, a lot of it's through the informal things. Now, to an extent, there are things that you can do that you make part of the infrastructure. You want to know when things are going wrong. So things like monitoring, alerting, those kind of things, whether that's a technical thing or a person-to-person thing, those kind of things are really important. Things like availability, things like presence.
Yeah.
Walking the factory floor, or the the equivalent, in a digital environment. Stop the line. Empowering people, and not just having monitoring systems, but empowering people who are doing the work to say, hey, I'm not satisfied with the state of affairs. I need people around me to collaborate with me so we can fix whatever upstream thing has caused me to be in the mess that I'm in now, and to bring it to the attention of managers and so on. Things like mission command, being really careful about describing, what it is you want describing the outcome as clearly as you can without unnecessarily constraining the solution, so that you make room for other people's expertise, which could easily be greater than yours. And that's the nature of knowledge work. Often it's the people on the ground that have the expertise, and certainly the on-the-ground knowledge. And also making innovation much more likely as well. The chief executive of the organisation isn't the source of most innovation. I mean, let's face it.
Yes.
But the chief executive of the organisation can certainly make it easier or harder for people to innovate, depending on how strategy is put together, how it's formulated, how it's expressed, those kinds of things. So availability, presence, making the organisation more trusting, because you can't be wasting all that precious communication bandwidth and decision-making bandwidth on people, doubling their efforts, not trusting other people to do their jobs. Double management and doing duplicate work and all those kind of things. Very, very, very wasteful. So you do need people to be more trusting. You need groups to be more trusting in organisations, but also more trustworthy. People do need to meet on their commitments, and people do need to know when things aren't working as well as they could be. So those monitoring escalation systems and so on that I talked about.
Yeah. So this is where the mutual trust building, right? The trust building comes in, and then helps.
Exactly. So that's the general problem. And then as a help to the reader, I point out some already documented models of leadership that I think have a contribution to make to building trust in organizations. So start with a really simple one, the inverted pyramid.
Yeah.
Where it's the job of the organization is to support the people who actually interface with the customer. That puts that the CEO is still at the pointy end of the organization, but they're at the bottom, not at the top. Their job is to support the people that support the people that support the people, sort of thing. It's a very simple model, and it does leave a whole load of questions unanswered. How far do you let people do the right thing for the customer? What are the boundaries around that? What budgets do they have? What policies apply, and so on. And apart from saying that's a problem that the organisation needs to solve, that's a problem I wasn't going to solve in the book. But then there are more well-established models. So servant leadership, the classic one.
You talked about servant leadership in that.
The diagnosis behind servant leadership is absolutely spot on. People will leave organisations that don't serve them. People will leave leaders that don't serve them. Whether the metaphor is right and whether the metaphor works as well as it did now in the 21st century, that's open to question. I still have no problem with service, being a servant, that kind of thing, but I know a lot of people do, and I understand actually why in some cultures that are trying to get away from, cultures of inequality, for example, that they are very nervous about that kind of metaphor. Host leadership is another one.
Host,
So that's so servant leadership was Greenleaf, Robert Greenleaf, classic book, great book. Whether or not you buy the metaphor, I still think it's a great book, and I've read it multiple times. Host leadership. Well, the book is called Host, something, and it's by Mark McCurgow and Heather Bailey anyway, I think. And so Mark McCurgow is one of the co-authors of the Solutions Focus, so already quite a well-known author. But the metaphor there is of the host. Now, you want to get people in for a particular event, a dinner party, or whatever it might be. You want people to enjoy a productive time together, and by productive, that might just mean enjoying a conversation with other people in the group. Define productive how you like. But there's some great lessons from that metaphor about what it means to be a good leader, in terms of, to what extent do I want to be, holding forth from the head of the table or sitting back and letting other people enjoy their conversations? To what extent should I be in the kitchen, making coffee, or should I be out there with people? Should I be, stepping back, getting a bit of distance, and taking in what's happening? All of those, not at the same time, but switching hats and so on is an important skill of leaders anyway. Less well known is Clear Leadership by Jervis Bush. I think a really good book on leadership. I should declare a little interest. So Jervis Bush is one of the one of the leading lights in the Dialogic and Generative organisation development community.
Okay.
He was kind enough to recognise Agendashift as belonging to that space, or at least having something to contribute to that space.
Right. That's
And it was
good.
he that invited me to write my fourth book, Organising Conversations, and in fact was its editor. So it's really nice to have from the academic OD community to have that
Yeah.
kind of recognition for
Yeah.
what we've been doing. That was really cool.
Mm.
So Jervis Bush, that's spelt Gervais, but it's Jervis is how it's
Jarvis.
pronounced. Jervis Bush with an E. Clear Leadership, really nice book, and it has a lot in common with things like coactive coaching and various other coaching models.
Oh, okay. Okay.
If you want to build trust
Yeah.
with somebody, well, you've
Yeah.
actually got to trust yourself as well.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
if you're not
Yeah.
grounded, if you're letting a whole lot of things distract you,
Yeah.
at least acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And don't kid yourself. And if you're kidding yourself, then don't think
Yeah.
you're going to have a trust-building conversation with people.
Yeah, that made me think, right? So because a lot of things what leaders do is they always see outside, they don't see some the inside, that even though trust, they think, oh, the trust is over there, not here within me, right? So they don't tend to work on themselves. They try to fix the system, right? So
yes. That's very true. Actually, I think back to my management career. When I was I worked my way up through UBS, the investment bank. I got to executive director. So not all the way to managing director, but I got to executive director. Not bad. And I think about the management. Think about the management training that I had. Well, all my opportunities for training started off more technical type of training, but very quickly I gravitated towards more leadership oriented type training, and the ones that made the most impact were always the ones that gave me more self-awareness. They weren't necessarily prescriptive, and you probably know I'm not big on prescription, but if it makes you more aware of yourself, that's got to be a help. And that is baked into that clear leadership model. And the last set of models, really, that's all intent-based models. I'm careful not to call it intent-based leadership because what's his name? The turn the ship around guy.
David Marquet.
He actually trademarked the term. So I was careful not to write the words in that particular order in the book. But we are talking turn the ship around, intent-based leadership, commander's intent. But what David Marquet does is actually really interesting because he mashes it up with servant leadership in a way, and helps people be more self-sufficient. And and that is a way of working those ideas down through his organisation. And it's a great book, a great audio book, Turn the Ship Around as well. And that was a great one to reference. So that was trust building leadership. And trust. I'm reminded actually by a friend of mine. We think of trust. You can think of it as an instrumental thing, as she puts it. Is it just something we do? We build trust, like psychological safety. Do we build trust? Do we build psychological safety because it makes the organisation work better? Or do we build trust and want things to be safe because we're decent human beings and we respect other people's rights to enjoy those same things? That's something to think about. And what's good here is that doing the right thing is the right thing, whichever way around you look at it.
That's definitely a question to ponder about, isn't it? How do we do that? Mike, I was thinking what do you think about situational leadership, right? I think is it like same as host leadership, where because you tend to see where the person is, where the situation is, and then you try to say direct or tell or be just a silence, just stay outside.
I've not studied situational leadership as such, under that heading. But in general, if you're prescribing, naughty of me to mention another podcast, but Laksh interviewed me a few weeks ago, and he said prescription is for the unserious.
Prescription is for the unserious. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a great phrase. And anyone who thinks that they know what other people should be doing without actually understanding the context that they are working in, is not being serious. And that applies very much to practitioners, and practitioners should be ashamed of themselves for prescribing without understanding context. But it's true of leaders as well. And it's very easy to think that everyone else is an idiot or everyone else has bad motives. but people are always operating in some kind of context, and it may well be the context that's driving the behaviour that you don't want. And
Yeah.
a bit of curiosity helps. A bit of empathy goes a very long way as well. Yeah.
It does. Yeah. No, true. And so, what we talked about, I'm thinking, is this what in we talked about complexity, in the organization and the change happening around the organizations. So what we just talked about, the excerpt, is basically, what does you think is what leading with purpose looks like in practice for the leaders?
Leading with purpose, if that's with capital letters, that's I don't know. I have a slightly non-standard view about purpose. I've read Start With Why and all those kind of books, and there is an assumption to some of those books that if only you can define the purpose, that everyone will be motivated and everything will be brilliant. And again, I think that's unserious.
Unserious, yeah.
Different people are motivated by different things. For some people it's the craft, for some people it's the social interaction, for some people it's the challenge, for some people it is meeting other people's needs, almost whatever they might be, and so on and so on and so on. And I think and this is part of servant leadership, actually, it is important that you can connect people's work to the mission of the organization. If you can't see that line of sight, if you can't see it, they certainly aren't going to be able to see it. So it's important to be able to make that line of sight, but I think it's very presumptuous to suggest that it's that mission is the ultimate motivation for each individual person. I think it should be enough that there is a connection, and you the way you get the best out of people is not to make them do it, but it's to create the conditions in which they can make those connections themselves, and where they have the space to express themselves in the way that they know best, in a way that's coherent with the other needs of the team, and so on. I'm not saying that everyone should just be an individual. Far from it. Teams are effective because you've got a group of people trying to achieve the same thing, but bringing different skills to it. And through the fact that they need to work together, and by how they coordinate and what they organise around and how they're organised and so on, that then constrains each other's behaviour. That is a necessary thing, and the idea that we can all be individuals and still deliver well as a team, is nonsense. It's absurd. But we do need to understand that we don't know a fraction of what goes on in other people's heads.
Yep.
Even when you ask them.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I have made my peace with that, and I think in a way I've turned it into a positive. You've just got to give people the chance.
That's it.
And I certainly don't prescribe what's going on in other heads, nor do I diagnose either, because I'm not a psychologist, and even psychologists just studying somebody at work wouldn't really know what's happening inside their heads, I don't think.
Yeah. 100%, Mike. I truly believe in that as well. That's why, like you said, you made peace. I made peace as well with that. So you can never know. You just go what's happening, and that's it.
Yeah.
Take it, do the next right thing. Move it forward. I think this is where the good learning for leaders. Don't try to think what others are thinking. Be curious, and then do the right thing. Like you said, wholeheartedly, so.
Yeah, I mean, the firmest ground is what you can actually see, what you can actually touch.
Yeah.
And, I've been studying quite a lot of philosophy recently, and that's often where it starts,
it does, actually, yeah.
When people start with, first principles, that's often very dangerous ground, because if people are starting from, principles that don't quite work, from assumptions that don't quite work, very, very quickly you get into trouble. And you make assumptions about what's going on in other people's head, you get into trouble very, very quickly. But you can deal with what's in front of you.
Yeah.
And you can inquire into, what explains what we're seeing. And you can make some guesses, you can make some assumptions, or you can actually have a conversation about it. What explains what we're seeing. And there are various ways of doing it, and some are quite well formalized. Others are just informal. But the longer you can withhold judgment and instead be curious in a way that gives people the opportunity to say something interesting, and perhaps at the same time contribute a way of actually making things better, well, that's got to be a win. So, yeah.
Amazing. I mean, yeah, that's true. So unfortunately, we are quite close to an end. But before we go, Mike, I wanted to ask you. In very simple terms, what's the leadership habit or a mindset? I mean, I'm not talking about mindsets. What's a habit that you believe is very underrated but very crucial today in leaders?
Yeah. Well, if I go back to engage, invite, celebrate, I know certainly in my time as a leader, I invested less in the celebrate part than perhaps I should have done. I was a bit on the relentless side, a bit on the remorseless side. It was always on to the next thing. I started to change. That was probably after I left UBS. It was when I was a CTO of a late stage startup. That's what I went to after UBS. And that was the case study actually for my first book, for Kanban from the Inside. And that book begins with me celebrating one of my own failures. I was a CTO and I'd broken the build and gone home from Hungary, where we were working, from Hungary back to the UK where I lived.
I remember you.
With the build broken, and I made up to the team with buying them cake. When you eat cake in Hungary, it's a big deal. I mean, they have these amazing cake shops.
Really? Okay.
So that's where that book started. Obviously, celebrating failure is a topic in its own right, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole just now. But actually, I'm not. I think I have in the past been guilty of not doing enough to celebrate successes as well. And I kind of learned that, I think, in the government digital space. When we finished a piece of work, it stayed up on the board quite a long time, and until at least until the next retro. Until we fully understood how well that piece of work was affecting the lives of people that we had deployed to, it stayed on the board. And when we could see that it was actually making a difference, that was something that we really would celebrate. I think we were learning to celebrate the difference we were making more than the hard work. And perhaps as a manager, I should also have been celebrating the hard work, or at least thanking people for it. But actually, we were really motivated by the fact that we were making a difference. Even back in my CTO days, we were doing that. We got tired of delivering features that nobody used. They were requested and they weren't used. And with the support of the manager of the people that were doing the asking, we got agreement that nothing was done until the person who asked for it could say, yes, this is making my life better.
Oh, okay. That's a great way to actually...
This is right to left thinking again, if you think about it. Yeah. So, everyone knows that conversation is coming. And it's like, if you know that the work is going to end up with some customer impact, if you know that the work is going to end up with accounting for the learning, that changes how you do the work. In this case, it changed how the work was even asked for, because they knew that if they asked for something stupid, there'd be a difficult conversation at the end of it. So that was an early example of before right to left was even a thing. That was an early example of it. So there's a lot of underappreciated stuff in that whole area of celebration. Celebrating successes, celebrating learning, celebrating failure. It's something to look forward to. When you start looking forward to things, it changes the way you think about the work. In psychological terms, you're creating a container. You've got some boundaries in time that you're working within, with some particular expectations around what's going to happen at the end of it. That changes the way you think about the work. It changes the way you collaborate. It changes the way you conduct your stand-up meetings, and so on and so on and so on. Celebration. Just as one example of something that helps to make a container for learning. I'll leave it at that.
No, thank you very much. And I can see, Mike, you mentioned a little bit like your journey as well as a leader. It has changed you know a lot from where you were earlier and now. So thanks for sharing that. Maybe we can talk about that more in the future episode, right? So
yes.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Mike, for sharing such a wisdom, all the things. I'll definitely recommend the book. I've already started reading it. And
search Wholehearted Mike Burrows on Amazon. You'll find it easily enough. But they put the links in there as well. That'd be great. Thank you.
I will definitely put the link in. And are you doing any new courses, new trainings for Agendashift as well?
I have just started the spring cohort of Leading in the Transforming Organisation. There will be an autumn one. So that is essentially the training of the book. I mean, I was already doing it I've done it in different formats. There's a workshop format, there's a 2-day format, a 3-day format. This is a cohort-based format, 2 hours a week for 7 weeks.
Nice.
So entry to the spring one is just closed, unfortunately, but there is one in the autumn. So if you go to agendashift.com/events, or just go to agendashift.com,
Cool.
you'll easily find it. Yeah.
Cool. No, I'll put the link as well in the description. So
thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for coming on to this Curiosulus Chronicles episode. Really, really amazing discussion we had. I'm sure leaders are going to learn a lot from this episode. Thank you very much.
Totally my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Okay, guys, take care. I'll be back with the new episode soon. Till then, take care, stay safe, and bye for now.